radio is not dead, but it is dying because radio requires you to submit to the editorial choices of the station, whether it's music or news or talk radio. You are not in control. Now, you can curate your own playlist on any number of apps instead. And so many new cars are wired for the internet that way. It's not even the technology that's the problem, like the old radio. It's why would you let someone else choose the news and opinion for you when you can so easily choose it for yourself? Well, because you're in a habit, that's one reason. Maybe you actually trust the news anchor, so you believe they make better choices than you. Or maybe you just want to hear what other people are listening to. That's a reason for me, although when 11 million people listen to, say, Joe Rogan's podcast, that could be a better barometer of what the world is listening to and talking about than radio. There are some personalities that are riveting. The late Rush Limbaugh, people tuned in just to hear him. I listen to CBC radio maybe once a year out of curiosity, like you might have going to see a strange animal at the zoo. To be candid, I do it once a year to see what the enemy is up to, because really, they truly are government journalists at the state broadcaster. They're not on your side. So this morning was my annual listen. It was the 8 a.m. radio news in Toronto, and I think I tuned in a minute or two late, so I think I missed the top item. But here's what I did hear. First, Ukraine. It was a story about how Russia had attacked a Ukrainian target, and the CBC said it was a double tap. That's the word they used. 2 strikes on the same target. The second one, the CBC implied, was targeting rescue personnel. The CBC then juxtaposed that with a peace conference, apparently, that Russia was not invited to, though, and tried to link the 2 stories, I think. Then there was a story about what the CBC called extreme weather. Apparently, it really rained hard in Philadelphia recently, and I'm sure it did. That this was one of their top news stories in Canada, which I thought was a bit odd. A bit later, they talked about the Amazon rainforest and how, they say, it now emits more carbon dioxide than it absorbs. I don't know how they do the math, or if things really have changed, or rather if it was just their methodology that changed. I have trouble believing that the world's largest tropical rainforest has changed meaningfully in the past decade. I think it's more likely that the scientists have changed how they measure things, or more likely yet, that agenda-driven journalists have changed things for reasons that they're hiding. We weren't told how this change happened, but we were immediately told it was bad news and that governments down there were really committed to doing something about it. But it was a clear 1-2 punch, maybe a double tap. After the story about how much it rained in Philadelphia, this Amazon story, I'm not sure what the news peg was for the Amazon story, other than they needed that little colorful comment about the rain story. Anyways, then they switched to the good news from the CBC's point of view. They went deep into the prosecution of Donald Trump and how he's a really, really bad dude, and his lawyers are too, and how, and I know this is shocking to you, and how Trump and his lawyers want to talk about their case in the news, in the media, and argue against it, and how they claim it's their First Amendment right. The CBC didn't seem to agree with that, but either way, the CBC was pretty excited about the whole thing. Trump hasn't been president in 3 years, let me remind you, but the CBC just can't stop thinking about him or talking about him. It's a bit of an obsession for them, but I get it. He's leading the polls, both to win the Republican presidential primary and then to beat Joe Biden. So maybe they can take him out through a bunch of prosecutions. When I say they, that would include the CBC, which thinks they're a player here. But then they moved on to a perennial CBC campaign talking about defunding the police, this time in Halifax. And the broadcast ended with a quirky story about an actors' strike in the United States. They tried to Canadianize it by saying how many actors it affects up here, but they quoted a clip from Fran Drescher. You know, she talks like this. It's about as American as can be. Remember Fran Drescher?
That's Bobby Sherman.
What's that?
That's his hair. Isn't he cute?
He's not really my type. I'm torn between Barney and Ted Koppel.
Yeah, but Bobby could sing. You should hear his records.
What's a record?
Just bury me.
Now, I later went to the CBC's website to try and catch the very first story of the day that I just missed by a minute. And I think it was their story about the CBC's own complaint, along with other media, to the Competition Bureau against Facebook. The CBC is sort of suing Facebook, they announced, for stopping linking to them. They want Facebook to link to them, of course, but Trudeau said Facebook has to pay media companies to link to them, and Facebook said that's not how the internet works. You don't have to pay to link to anybody. That's not economical. So no thank you. If they have to pay to link to someone, they just won't link to them anymore. Trudeau said Facebook had been stealing content from journalists, so Facebook stopped stealing that content. And now Trudeau's CBC wants them to steal the content again. It's quite a weird story. And of course, the CBC is a player, not just a reporter. It's quite something to hear the CBC, which has monopolistic power and state funding, complain about what they call a monopoly, Facebook. I don't like Facebook much, but at least I'm not forced to support it with my taxes like I am the CBC. Now, I listened and I thought, all these stories, I have just visited another parallel universe. I mean, I know what the words mean that they used: Facebook, Trump, Ukraine, weather, police, rainforest, actors. I know them like I know colors of paint: red, orange, yellow, green, blue. But boy, did they paint a world I just can't recognize. Like I say, fewer people than ever listen to CBC radio. People with that old habit do it. People who don't know how to use the internet to curate their own content. People who want that Trudeau point of view, there are some, but fewer people than ever. But boy, if you are one of those people, you live in a world that has a different colored sky than my world. Let me give you some thoughts on these stories, if I may. The first of all, I mean, look, I think Ukraine is big news. I don't know if it's top news every single day. That's more of a drumbeat than anything. A missile strike by Russia, I suppose that's news, though the war has raged on for 18 months, and I'm not sure if this two-missile attack warrants top breaking news story. I feel like there's a media campaign to keep the war on the top of our minds. I do not like the war, and I do not like the killings, and I wish the war would end. I certainly don't like attacks on civilians or civilian areas by Russia, or one last week, a drone attack against the downtown business district in Moscow.
Прямо около нас сейчас летел беспилотник в соседнее здание. Просто в соседнее. Бомбят пяточку.
Yeah, I think the war should stop, but look, that's a matter of editorial opinion, how newsy that attack is.